February of 2022 was a stacked month for high-profile video game releases, and at the forefront of all of them was Elden Ring. FromSoftware have garnered something of a cult following over the past decade, so naturally there was a lot of hype for their latest release. From the outside, Elden Ring looked to be an incredibly enticing prospect, not only because they collaborated with George R.R. Martin for world-building purposes, but also because it was going to be their first crack at open world. An open world Souls game. That sounds spicy. The premise alone was enough for me to pre-order the game. I just could not resist, which caught me by surprise. I'm not the biggest fan of FromSoft games. I do enjoy them, and I absolutely love Sekiro, as well as Bloodborne, but I just find the structure of these titles particularly fatiguing, with the constant back and forth, rezzing and running to the boss room and all that shit. You know what I'm talking about. Still, whenever a new game of theirs is released, I feel compelled to at least try it at some point, because I am fully aware of their tremendous quality. With that said, I did not go into this game with any specific expectations in mind. Well, other than imminent and repeated death, of course. Unsurprisingly, that expectation was fulfilled, but my time with Elden Ring was very much a joyous one. It provided the most fun I have had in a FromSoft game since I played Sekiro. I think it does have problems in its balancing, particularly in the late game, as well as some other specifics that I did not agree with, but the exploration and discovery aspect was phenomenal, whilst the combat kind of blew me away with how much versatility was on offer. I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Elden Ring, more than I ever thought I was going to, and now I'm here to talk about it. There's a lot to cover, so let's dive right in, and be forewarned that this video will contain some spoilers. I did try to avoid this, but I can't talk about it properly without doing so. At its core, Elden Ring is essentially open-world Dark Souls. In fact, pretty much everything in this game is closer to Dark Souls than any of FromSoft's other titles, but if you have experience with those games, then you'll likely recognize certain elements from them. In a way, Elden Ring does feel like the culmination of all of FromSoft's previous works. The game has a really strong introduction. After the usual pick your class and inevitably die to a boss just minutes later, we find ourselves in Limgrave, the starting area. Opening this door and venturing into the lands between for the first time is a magnificent moment. It sets the scene marvelously. From here, the game's open-world design becomes immediately apparent. You are completely free to roam the land as you please, and even at this early stage it feels different, special almost. I was bursting with excitement and couldn't wait to see what the game had to offer. The very first thing I did was take on the Tree Sentinel, and this thing was just kicking my ass. It was a very one-sided affair. This boss is intentionally placed here to teach you something very important. If you're struggling with an encounter, you should go out and explore the world. This is especially true for the first major boss, Margit, who can be exceptionally tough if you rush towards him. Limgrave is designed with a clear linear path to his arena, but it still maintains a distinct openness, and that is something that persists throughout the entire game. This is a key element of Elden Ring's world design, and the freedom you have to do as you please is genuinely invigorating. Exploration is essential, and you're almost always rewarded in some way for doing so. The lands between is indeed massive, but it's also very dense and tightly packed, with hundreds of points of interest, ranging from caves to catacombs, castles, forts, hidden towers, and even secret areas that are massive on their own. It's hard not to stumble upon something when roaming the land, and that urges the player to continue on. Organic discovery through free-form exploration. It's an area where Elden Ring explodes in quality, although admittedly I do have a couple issues with it, which I'll discuss later. The only guidance you receive are golden rays of light emitted by sights of grace, checkpoints acting exactly like the bonfires, lanterns, and sculptors' idols of FromSoft's previous entries. They provide a general direction of where you must go next, which may very well be on top of a cliff, or in a castle. It's up to you to find out. Occasionally an NPC or an item can give you a clue, assuming you even speak to them or happen to stumble across the item, but otherwise the rays of light are all the help you will get in this game. The ambiguousness that FromSoft are known for is very much present here, with varying degrees to it depending on the situation. There are no waypoints, and I only remember a couple instances, the Volcano Manor contracts being one of them, where explicit markers were put down. And even when they are put down, you can take as many detours as you like. The player is given a lot of freedom in not just how they wish to approach things, but also when they wish to, and it's a refreshing change-up to the usual trappings that have become all too standard. There's been a lot of discussion over the past couple months on the hand-holding nature of open-world games and how Elden Ring deviates from that immensely. Now personally, I do not mind if my hand is being held in a video game, to a certain extent of course, so long as what I get out of it is fun and worth my time. It is a tricky line for developers to walk, because most of the time they're trying to tell a story, and when a game is holding your hand too much, it becomes very noticeable and peels away from some of the excitement, which is a problem I think Red Dead Redemption 2 suffers from. Elden Ring, with how much it leaves up to the player's discretion, is a unique experience that is very rewarding. Progressing through the game does require you to take on a set of mandatory encounters in areas you must visit if you want to reach the end, but how and when you go about that is up to you. To a degree, there is some flexibility in which shard bearers you can kill, but other bosses like Godfrey, for example, must be taken down. This level of freedom to do as you please is something I have not experienced in a video game since I played, and you know what's coming here, Breath of the Wild, and for a FromSoft game to achieve that is undoubtedly amazing. The only roadblocks come in the form of high-level enemies, and for some areas you'll need a specific item to access them, but there usually is a different route, or perhaps several routes, you just need to find them. You never really know, but you trust FromSoft to provide multiple ways of achieving everything. There is an awful lot to see and do, and the map is absolutely enormous. It's actually quite deceiving at first. You collect one piece and think to yourself, wow, that's pretty big. But then you collect another, and another, and then another, and its scale slowly starts to dawn on you. This game is gigantic, and this is just the overground. I really appreciate how this map is designed. It's surprisingly detailed, and the more you examine it, the more you will start to notice elements that can make your life a little easier, like where obelisks are located. These are where you will find map fragments uncovering the rest of the map. There are also these small circles indicating where one of the not-so-hidden caves are located. The golden orbs on the map represent sites of grace you have discovered, and you can fast travel to them with the click of a button, cutting backtracking down substantially, and that's perfect. This is one of many elements that aim to complement the game's open world. After reaching your third site of grace, you'll be gifted a spectral steed named Torrent. I absolutely love Torrent. He's great for getting around the place, and he lets me employ one of my favorite strategies: running the fuck away. Seriously, you could be casually exploring an area and all of a sudden a giant dragon appears out of nowhere. The world has a lot of moments of spontaneity like that, so having the option to reliably dodge encounters helped keep my sanity intact. There's also combat from horseback, which is actually a good option against certain field bosses, but you don't do nearly as much damage as you would on your feet, so I generally avoided it. Taking a page from Sekiro, Elden Ring has a dedicated jump button, and it feels so much more natural to perform than in the Souls games. This also applies to your mount. Torrent can double jump, making some platforming situations a lot easier to get by. There is a lot of up and down to this game. The Lands Between is a very vertical world, and the vast majority of it is interconnected in classic FromSoft fashion. It's loads of fun to explore, and is very impressive design-wise. That interconnectivity is further ramped up inside legacy dungeons, essentially special areas usually in the form of castles and fortresses, and the level design of these sections left me in awe time and time again. Everything is connected so cleverly in these locations, with an abundance of alternate pathways, shortcuts, and secret areas just waiting to be discovered. The crumbling Farum Azula was one of the highlights of the game for me. It piques your curiosity right away, and traveling through it was loads of fun. From beginning to end, I was stumbling into sub-area after sub-area, and it just kept on happening. The world is intricately woven together, and it's a joy to travel through, for the most part. Let's say a big collective fuck you to the subterranean shunning grounds. I hate this place. There's a boss at the end of these sewers and he's quite difficult, but the real challenge is navigating through this shithole. It's so confusing, it has dangerous platforming sequences, and it's full of enemies that love to ambush you. I ended up searching for a YouTube video on where to go because I was losing my mind here. I went into this game with such pure intentions, deciding not to look up a guide or scouring the internet for clues to help me on my way or anything like that. But there are times when I feel the game is a bit too ambiguous for its own good, especially if you're trying to find specific items, like the Halictree secret medallions. Are you meant to be able to find these without a guide? Okay, one of them you'll likely find eventually, but the other one is given to you by such an obscurely placed NPC. I don't really know if this is the best sort of design to have in a game, but it is part of what makes the FromSoft experience so memorable, and maybe I missed some clues or something. It's hard to tell most of the time. Interactions with NPCs in general are important. I went out of my way to speak with everyone repeatedly, exhausting their dialogue and listening carefully to what they have to say, as they'll often give hints pertaining to their quests. You don't have a log or a journal in this game, you have to figure everything out by yourself. There's a healthy number of side quests, some of which have a very convoluted set of steps to complete, but they are engaging and they all give meaningful rewards as well. I really enjoyed Rani's questline. It's quite a long one that takes you through a bunch of different areas meeting various people. The game's inhabitants are rather dynamic. They often move locations and some just disappear or die without saying a word. It's interesting, it makes me want to know more about their situations and discover their stories. There are all sorts of colourful characters in this game, but my favourite is this guy Blade. I just think his design is badass. I'm also a fan of this huge turtle wearing a mitre named Miriel that can teach you some spells. His smooth voice and general presence was rather calming to me. As an extension of this, some of the bosses have fascinating backstories to them. This game has some intriguing lore, but it's primarily spread out through dialogue with NPCs and item descriptions, the typical FromSoft approach. Reading up on the lore does highlight George R.R. Martin's influence on the world, especially if you're familiar with his work. Outside of the cutscene at the very beginning of the adventure, most of the in-game stuff is told in a very subtle fashion, and you can go through the whole game without paying attention to it. I don't think Elden Ring's lore is quite as hauntingly compelling as Bloodborne's. I mean, it's a different premise altogether, to be fair, and that may just be because I'm not too well versed with it, but it's certainly got its fair share of mystery and intrigue. Now, given how much is left up to the player in this game, I did find myself getting lost a few times. At one point, I was prancing around for something like 3 hours with no idea where to go or what to do, and eventually I looked up some stuff about the game. This is where I stumbled upon a character build on YouTube, the Bloodblade. I'll leave a link to it in the description if anyone's interested. Anyway, after watching that video, I decided to make a brand new character and follow this build, which focuses on an agile fighter using dual blades to build up the bleed effect on enemies. This rips off a large portion of their health bar when attacks land on them in quick succession. It took a bit of time to fully understand this build, but I'd be lying if I said this wasn't the best decision I made when playing this game. I usually just stick with the trusty sword and shield strength build in these games. This, however, offered a completely different dynamic, and I fell in love with it. It's actually closer to a Bloodborne fighting style, since I had to be aggressive to build up the bleed effect and rely on nothing but reading attack patterns and dodging for defensive purposes. I was having way more fun with this setup, and felt confident tackling whatever the game threw at me. At a fundamental level, combat in Elden Ring is standard FromSoft stuff that, again, is closer to Dark Souls than their other titles. There is a lot of weight to your movement, everything from attacking, dodging, and even casting spells costs stamina, and there's a bit of wind-up to everything you do as well. Stamina management is a crucial part of surviving encounters, so you need to be careful with how you approach things. Your primary method of healing comes in the form of flasks of Crimson Tears. They are the Estus flasks of this game, and choosing the correct time to heal is another important aspect to consider. Now, while the basics of the game are very similar to Dark Souls 3, combat in Elden Ring feels much smoother and offers a more polished experience with some truly awesome versatility. One of the first things the game teaches you is the guard counter, allowing you to perform a counter-attack immediately after blocking an enemy's attack. You can also perform a jumping attack now, which is a great option that I personally abused. These are some of the best ways to break an opponent's stance. Every enemy, including bosses, has an invisible stance bar. Think of it like the posture bar in Sekiro. When it's full, the enemy becomes staggered, allowing you to go in for a critical hit. Depending on what build you're using, it may be more beneficial to cast a spell or use normal attacks when they're staggered. Since I was using a dual-wielding bleed build, it was actually better for me to just keep hacking away at my opponent as much as I could. Dual-wielding opens up even more attacks for you to use, rather than sticking to the standard light and heavy options. By pressing L1, I can attack with both of my weapons at the same time, which was the perfect option for the build I was using. You can also crouch and use stealth to your advantage, which is an absolute godsend in certain sections. I love that stealth is a legitimate option here. I found myself crouching and sneaking past enemies a lot. Most weapons in this game have skills and affinities attached to them, allowing the player to execute unique offensive or defensive techniques. What's more is that almost all of these skills can be replaced using a special item called Ashes of War. These are some of the most interesting techniques in the game, and the sheer number of them means there is a tremendous amount of adaptability for every build. I primarily used the Bloody Slash Ashes of War, which was such an amazing option against opponents with shields or flying enemies that I struggled against. You also dip down a bit just before performing the attack, and that really highlighted how precise the hitboxes are. These are a lot of fun to use, and they encourage experimentation. Honestly, the entire game encourages experimentation, and this is easily one of Elden Ring's strongest aspects, how it caters to multiple playstyles and the many options you have when customizing your character. There are so many interesting builds on the internet thanks to the huge variety of weapons, shields, spells, incantations, Ashes of War, the list goes on. Elden Ring has the most expansive set of combat options I have ever seen in a FromSoft game. There is surely a playstyle that will appeal to you, and if that's not the case at first glance, you have some flexibility to create your own, and that is amazing. The sheer versatility you have in this game to approach combat really is incredible. Furthermore, after defeating a certain boss, you have the option to respec your attributes, so you're not completely tied down, which is great. Speaking of spells, I've heard it been said that magic use is a necessity in this game, and I am here to debunk that theory, because I never use magic and finish the game just fine. In New Game Plus I've gone with a spellcaster build, and I'm just destroying everything, it's a lot of fun. One of the more contentious additions are Spirit Ashes. These allow you to summon a spirit companion to aid you in battle. You first need the Spirit Calling Bell, which you can get from Rani near the beginning of the game, and use it to call forth whatever spirit you have selected, but only when this monument icon appears on the left side of your screen. You can do this for almost every boss, certainly all the major bosses, and in various areas throughout the world. These are incredibly helpful during encounters, not only providing extra damage, but also acting as a fantastic distraction for you to get some hits in. It's like summoning NPCs just before fog gates, which you can still do for some fights in this game, but it's part of your setup, and you can even use the Spirit Ashes with the summoned NPCs in tandem. Like the Ashes of War, there are loads of different types of spirits in this game, you just need to find them. They can also be upgraded so they scale better whenever you reach the endgame. I find this to be a really interesting inclusion from FromSoft. For some reason there are still people asking for a straight up easy mode for these games. You're not going to get it, and I believe you shouldn't get it, and I'm not saying Spirit Ashes are this game's equivalent to easy mode or anything, but they certainly do help, don't they? There are some extremely powerful spirits in this game, perhaps even a little too powerful. There's a spirit called the Mimic Tear, right? It basically summons a direct copy of your character with the same weapons, armor, spells, Ashes of War, etc, etc. So for me, my Mimic Tear could also apply the bleed effect on enemies, and together, we ripped bosses to shreds. It was so obscenely powerful that it got nerfed in patch 1.03, but I've been using it since then, and it's still crazy effective, even in New Game Plus. I don't think these spirits completely break the game. They've been included for a reason, right? But I do think they have the potential to outright trivialize some encounters. To give you an example, I was struggling on a particular boss for some time, so I decided to do a bit of grinding. I killed a different boss, leveled up a bit, and upgraded my Mimic Tear from +5 to +10. When I went back to that boss, I annihilated her on my first attempt. My Mimic Tear even got the killing blow, and this is post-nerf. This isn't the only thing in Elden Ring that is absurdly powerful. Certain spells and build setups feel like they get completely out of control. There's also the very real possibility that you over-level your character, which is something that happened to me. I breezed through the final chunk of this game. I suppose that's the price of freedom. Don't get me wrong, it is super fun to destroy my enemies, but there seems to be some balancing issues here. The Spirit Ashes definitely help make the game more accessible to a wider audience, there's no doubt about that, but some of them do feel a bit too powerful. On the flip side, I did notice that the behavior of some bosses becomes much more erratic when they have to fight more than one opponent, which is not ideal with this level of punishment. I also think certain bosses are particularly difficult without using spirits, Renala being one of them, as well as Commander Nile. Ultimately, this is a video game, and you play games to have a good time, and if using Spirit Ashes facilitates that, then you absolutely should use them. As I just said, they're in the game for a reason, and if you don't like them, then you don't have to use them, which is the approach I am taking on my latest playthrough. People love to play these games with self-imposed challenges like that. All of this stuff combined means that Elden Ring does feel like one of the better FromSoft games to start with. There are so many different playstyles you can employ, and various methods to make the journey a little bit more bearable. Don't misunderstand me though, it's certainly not a walk in the park, but you can offset some of that difficulty with the right builds and abilities, which has always been the case in Souls games to some extent. I should also mention that the world does not scale with your level, so returning to some of the starting zones when you're more powerful means you will plow through enemies and bosses. With that in mind, I urge people to take their sweet time with this game. There's no sense of urgency whatsoever, so explore as much as it pleases you. Perhaps an enemy scaling option is something they could add to the game in the future. I don't know what the logistics behind that would be, but it's just a thought. As with any FromSoft game, the bosses are some of the biggest highlights, and there's a shitload in Elden Ring. You can find bosses literally everywhere, with some just appearing out of thin air in certain locations. There's incredible variety in the bosses' designs, they're extremely aggressive, and some of the major encounters are nothing short of spectacular. The first major boss, Margit, is an excellent introduction to the game's difficulty. I feel his position in the game is really well placed, and sets the tone for the rest of the adventure wonderfully. As I said before, this fight is exceptionally tough if you rush towards him without exploring the world. One boss I seriously struggled against was the Draconic Tree Sentinel. It took a lot of time for me to understand his attack patterns fully, but when I finally downed him, I practically exploded off my chair. It was such a great moment. Another boss that really stood out to me was Godfrey, First Elden Lord. This right here is my favorite kind of boss in these games. It is a one-on-one, no bullshit, test of your abilities. He has a fairly small set of attacks that are all clearly telegraphed, yet they can still catch you off guard and punish your mistakes, especially when he mixes up the delay on his axe swings. Admittedly, he is one of the easier bosses in this game, but the sense of progression you get from the multiple attempts it takes to slay him is absolutely glorious. It feels so fucking good to dodge all of his attacks repeatedly. You also respawn right outside the fog gate. Thanks, Miyazaki. You actually respawn really close to almost every encounter now. There are these statues called Stakes of Marika, which you can choose to respawn at. They are everywhere, and I seriously appreciate that. Cutting down on the back and forth is another element that I believe makes Elden Ring a bit more accessible and less mind-numbing than FromSoft's previous titles. I also really enjoyed the fights against Mog, Lord of Blood, and Mog the Omen. They felt tightly crafted like Godfrey, and once more the progression I experienced trying to down them was a really good time. The only problem I have with the Lord of Blood fight is this instance where you're guaranteed to take damage. Not a fan of that. I found Melania to be the hardest boss, personally. As much as I enjoyed the spectacle of the fight, her flurry combo is just ridiculous. Dodging this one attack is what makes or breaks the entire encounter, and I don't think that is good design, personally. You practically need to be frame perfect to evade this shit. I think it's a bit much. Something I notice with pretty much every boss is how delayed some of their weapon swings are. In the most extreme cases, a boss will raise their weapon above their head for what feels like 6 to 8 seconds before slamming it down. It's very easy to start panic rolling during these situations, which will almost always lead to your death. This was one of the most challenging aspects of encounters for me, because bosses love to mix up the delay on their weapon swings, as I stated before in the example with Godfrey. On one hand, I find it a clever way of maintaining the series' difficulty, as I instinctively want to dodge as soon as I see the weapon being raised, but on the other hand, I feel it reduces large portions of fights into guessing games, and that seems a bit irregular to FromSoft's usual boss design. It's also important to consider what direction you roll as well. Going the wrong way may leave you vulnerable, and so some experimentation is required to nail down where specifically you should be rolling to. I also have to bring up the camera, and in my experience this has always been a recurring issue in the Soulsborne series, especially if you're a melee fighter. I've said it before and I'll say it again, if you are fighting a boss and you or they are backed up against a wall, the camera lock-on function fights against it, and it can be a real hindrance in the worst cases. Doubly so if the boss likes to jump around a lot. It's disorienting and can lead to plenty of deaths. Thankfully in Elden Ring, boss arenas are usually massive, but this is something that cropped up now and then. I did enjoy the vast majority of these boss fights, and I find that impressive due to the sheer number of them, all using their own fighting styles and crazy abilities. They're a great challenge and massively satisfying to overcome, but the unique ones more so than the repeats. Elden Ring is guilty of recycling a lot of its content. Enemies, bosses, puzzles, and in particular underground dungeons. They're all very similar to one another, and they're confusing to navigate as a result. I think it would have been much more beneficial and exciting if they were all completely unique, but the sheer number of them means that would be a lot of extra work. FromSoft have clearly put the most effort into the overworld and the underground areas, as opposed to the caves and whatnot, which does make sense, but these places are way too alike. Sometimes you're trekking through some catacombs and finally make it to the fog gate, only to face a reskin of a boss you fought before, or maybe even the exact same boss as before. Or perhaps it's a slightly weaker version of a boss you fought previously or may do in the future. Or maybe it's the spirit version of a boss you've fought before. This kind of thing happens often, even for some of the major bosses, and that does feel a bit odd. To the game's credit, they all drop unique rewards, but fighting the same Crucible Knight or Erdtree Avatar or Godskin bosses does detract from their allure. I mentioned earlier how there's almost always something to discover when roaming the land, and that is true, but a lot of times what you discover is something you may have already seen, and I imagine that will be a bit disappointing for some people. Most of the time the payoff is good, but there are a lot of repeat encounters scattered throughout the journey. I've seen some people describe this as lazy, and I do kind of get where they're coming from in all fairness, especially in regards to the catacombs and such. It's not something that greatly hindered the overall experience for me, but it is noticeable. Graphically, Elden Ring continues that medieval fantasy art style that FromSoft have utilized repeatedly. There is some incredible architecture on offer, which has always been one of my favorite aspects of the Soulsborne series, and it makes traveling through forts and castles very enjoyable. This is counterbalanced by stunning natural vistas and an eerie mysteriousness to the world itself. Every area makes use of a specific color scheme, and they all possess their own unique atmosphere and feeling as a result. Combining this with highly detailed environments, a vast draw distance, as well as top-notch lighting and shadow effects, makes for a truly beautiful open world. And at the center of everything is the magnificent Erdtree in all its splendor, looming over the lands with a certain majesty to it. The soundtrack is also excellent. This game has an amazing main menu theme. I was shocked when I first heard this. I just wasn't expecting it. An epic orchestral piece with choir vocals, one of my favorite combinations in music. Actually, that combination is present for most of the tracks in this game, particularly during boss fights, with some of the standout pieces for me being Godfrey's theme, and especially the theme that plays for the final boss. It's so good and fits with the aesthetic wonderfully. The world itself mainly consists of atmospheric noises and subtle ambient pieces with light instrument work. It's not quite as dead silent as FromSoft's other titles, and I appreciate that choice of direction for this game. Now, Elden Ring has received some criticism for its technical performance, particularly the PC port, which is the version I played. I can't speak for everyone, obviously, but the only technical hiccups I experienced were frame drops. I noticed it the most when I was fighting dragons and they started spewing fire. The frame rate just can't handle this. Besides that though, there was not much else. The only other thing I can think of is that sometimes there was a very short delay when rendering the world, but that issue is so minor it didn't bother me in the slightest. I don't know why I always have such good luck in this department, but the game ran perfectly fine for me. Of course, your experience may differ. Despite this being a 30-minute video, I feel I've only scratched the surface here. There's a bunch of stuff I haven't mentioned, like crafting, which I never used personally, multiplayer elements, great rune powers, and all the different types of gear in the game. The talismans seem to be the most important components of your setup, besides your weapon, of course. I enjoyed finding new ones and experimenting with them. Another thing I love are the messages left by other players. They can range from useless garbage to legitimately helpful advice pointing you in the direction of an alternate path or warning you of what's ahead. My favorites are the ones that call out the bullshitters putting down intentionally misleading messages. There's a sense of community here that gives these games a lot of charm, and I love the lingo that accompanies them. It's pretty entertaining. To see everything that this game has to offer is something that requires the utmost of dedication and a hell of a lot of time. It really is massive, and the sheer versatility you have in combat is genuinely mind-boggling. It does wonders for replayability. I've started a new game and chosen the Wretch class, so I can receive the most challenging experience, and so I'm forced to use whatever I happen to find. Even after finishing the game, I am looking forward to my next playthrough. Despite being extremely passionate about the medium, that is quite rare for me. Only a handful of games have prompted that kind of response, and I never thought this would be one of them. Elden Ring surpassed all of my expectations. Once I really got into it, I could not put it down. I got lost in Elden Ring, both figuratively and literally, and relished every opportunity to delve deeper into its mysteries. It stands tall, right alongside Sekiro, and just above Bloodborne as my all-time favorite FromSoft title. Do I think it's a once-in-a-decade masterpiece? No, but I do think it's a fantastic game. I really enjoyed my time with this one. It is a very strong contender for Game of the Year. My question now, though, is where do they go from here? Will the next game be open world? I get the feeling it won't be. There are still endless opportunities for more tightly focused adventures, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who prefer that type of structure. In the meantime, I'm hoping some DLC will come for this game at some point, especially since Sekiro didn't have any, at least not in the form of major content additions, but if it ever does arrive, I'll be sure to try it out. Elden Ring is brilliant, and given how many options there are to approach combat, as well as cutting down on the back and forth, it definitely feels like one of the more accessible FromSoft games. It's also bursting with epic moments, engaging boss fights, satisfying progression, phenomenal exploration, and a really fascinating open world. FromSoft have done it again, and this time in truly spectacular fashion. Thanks for watching.